Hi everyone. So I'm Nadia. I'm from Education Perfect, and I'm here today to talk a bit about effective data communication and what I believe are the three biggest barriers to that. So before I get started, a bit of context about my company. We're a market-leading edutech company founded in 2007 as a languages product, but we expanded to be multi-subject in 2013. We're a classroom aid and an online learning and assessment tool currently supporting over 1 million students globally across over 2,000 schools. About myself, I'm 23, originally from the UK, but I spent the past 10 years living in New Zealand, hence that kind of warped accent you're probably hearing, and I now live in Sydney. I study computer science and psychology at university, and I also started part-time at EP while I was studying in the customer support space. After graduating, I joined the engineering team as a junior backend developer, but I found I had a really strong preference for any database-driven work over any backend coding. Back then, the company didn't have a data team, and so any reports or data requests were coming through to that engineering team, and I was trying to take as many of those as I could. In September of last year, we did end up forming our first data and insights team, and so I moved into an exclusively data role, which is where I am now. This was ended up being for a number of different reasons. One was we had undergone some rapid expansion, and we had dreams of further expanding into the international market. And we also had a new CEO come on board who wanted to make data-driven decision making to be the cornerstone of our growth. Since we were transitioning away from the engineering team and into our own team, and we were also trying to reconcile 12 years of patchy data requests, we were working on a much more ad hoc basis, and we found that data communication became quite a big problem for us. So when I talk about data communication, I mean everyone should be speaking the same language. I don't mean SQL versus Python, but I mean that coworkers should be able to talk to each other about key data points from the business and fully understand each other. I mean that coworkers should be able to come to my team with a simple question and not receive a series of follow-up questions and a 5-minute talk on why they might not be getting what they think they're getting. And other teams should be able to talk to each other without my team getting involved and compare key data points and fully agree on what those terms mean. When everyone's speaking the same language and using the same words, we empower our colleagues to feel confident in our data. But how do we get there? Well, like I said, I believe I've identified the three biggest barriers to this because I've spent a lot of this year thinking about this problem. I think the first barrier is getting the right people involved in the conversation, in the naming and definition process. The second is ensuring that the data can be implemented in our data warehouse in a way that's good enough. And the third barrier is making sure that once the data has been defined and implemented, anyone in the company is able to find and use that data. You can picture this as a Venn diagram. Without addressing all three, the whole thing topples over. There's going to be times in every business when only one or two of the circles are addressed. And I'll be discussing in this talk times when my company has done this and the repercussions we faced. Essentially, you do need all three circles to achieve that effective communication across the company. So let's look to the data team being formed in my company and some situations that occurred there. The first one I talked to is stakeholder involvement. So our sales team had defined a sales pipeline that made sense to them, with rules and meanings for when a customer moves between two parts of the pipeline. However, they didn't really have any tools at the time to mark a customer as one stage or another because we were using our own homegrown CRM and we were still in that earlier stage of the rapid growth. The team themselves intuitively knew which stage a customer was in because they were working with them closely on a daily basis. But this situation meant that if they went to our marketing team and asked them to email all of our warm leads, then our marketing team had no idea who to be emailing. It also meant that if they came to our engineering team for that high level reporting, there was no consistent way for us to get that data. How I defined an edge case for a trialing customer might differ to another engineer, which could mean that the sales team get two completely different numbers. So we, as the engineers, decided to introduce some implementation to the pipeline, and we gave them a dropdown. This meant that our sales team could mark each customer with which pipeline stage they were in, and we could use the results of that dropdown for our high-level reporting. Except we hadn't really worked with our sales team to automate this or learn their rules, and so it was a very manual process, meaning they didn't use it and it was never kept up to date. It also turned out that each of our regional teams had slightly different meanings for each stage, so this didn't really solve any of our problems. Looking at another part of the company now, everyone in the company knew that churn was bad and that we wanted to avoid it as much as possible. And in general, everyone knew that it was a loss or decrease of revenue. But we'd found that if we sat down and looked at it, it had completely different meanings depending on which stakeholders we were talking to. Overall, everyone was pretty confused. So at the end of last year, when our data and insights team was formed, we finally had the time and people power to start trying to solve our company's confusion. After looking at all the previous flops, we realized that the only way we would succeed is if we overcame all three barriers at once. And so I created a process that we've affectionately dubbed the Definitive Data Definition Doc. Say that 5 times fast. I'd start by running workshops, chatting to coworkers, reading over old Slack messages and emails, looking into queries I'd run often, trying to pull together the most common requests, and then stripping them down to the most logical data points. I'd then name and define each of them with 3 core principles in mind. I wanted to keep as much of the logical existing terminology as possible so that the learning curve for my colleagues was manageable and I didn't just walk in with a brand new dictionary. If our existing terminology didn't fit, I'd fall back to SaaS terminology so that new coworkers would likely be familiar with the terms when coming on board, thus reducing their learning curve as well. If existing terminology or SaaS terminology didn't quite fit, or the words were too confusing and overloaded, I'd look to ideas from shared cultural context. For example, a lot of my New Zealand-based colleagues are a big fan of skiing, and so we used the concept of a ski pass to introduce passes as a named data point in our licensing system. From there, I draw rough diagrams of how we could display the data at a higher level. And then I'd take my definitions and diagrams to my team and coworkers, and I'd ask them questions like, does anything I have here surprise you? From there, we'd discuss their confusion, and I'd ask them to describe things to me in their own words. I wanted them to care about each data point conceptually, as opposed to focusing on the specific numbers. If you can understand the concept behind something, you're more likely to incorporate it into your terminology and be more empowered to use the data. I also found that using specific numbers at this stage in the process became really distracting because a lot of my stakeholders were focusing on why a number was so high or so low instead of what the number actually meant or displayed. So when we went through this stage, I just used those rough diagrams and talk about things conceptually. From there, I'd go model the definitions in dbt and I'd dig out any outliers and redefine them. And then I'd create high-level dashboards in our BI tool mode. Then I take these back to the stakeholders and compare the conceptual diagrams with the real diagrams and ask questions such as, based on our current definition for this, we have this many. Does that feel right to you? We'd also discuss any outliers at this point and iterate over it until we were happy with what we had. This stage is also really important since understanding the data points in the abstract is great early on in the process to avoid that distraction. But then it's important to loop back to the real data since sometimes you can discover the scale of things is much higher or lower than you originally thought. Once we were all happy, we would finalize the definition and models, and we would add the definitions to our Google Doc, the definitive data definition doc, which was accessible by anyone in our company. We'd also share those top level dashboards from Mode, and we'd run workshops with the wider company to introduce them to the definitions, explaining the thought processes behind it. This meant that even if they forgot the specifics, they could infer the rules from the underlying principles. Once we'd rolled everything out, we found our colleagues were answering each other's questions without us even getting involved. And the questions we were receiving were much more complex, since the simple questions became self-serviceable. We had a few pages in a Google Doc that people could use to incorporate into their daily routines, and this seemed to answer many of our questions. We started receiving requests from different parts of the business for a similar thing, and so we'd repeat our process. Identifying the data, naming and defining, validating with stakeholders, roughly implementing, revalidating, iterating if needed, and then finalizing and making them accessible. We thought we'd nailed it, and we all lived happily ever after. Sure, some of you noticed that I've still got a bit of time left in this talk, so it's going to come as no surprise that we didn't live happily ever after. Our process was great at a small scale, but the more we repeated the process for different data, the more we realized that it wasn't a one-size-fits-all. We definitely had the implementation side of things down, since that's our job, but cracks started to show, and we realized we weren't doing so well in those other two circles. We'd become overconfident in our flow of carrying out the process that we hadn't checked in to see if what we were doing was still fit for purpose. The first time we realized the errors of our ways, it was the stakeholder involvement side of things that slipped. We were trying to identify what it meant to be a monthly active user for the teachers of our platform. I suggested we use any teacher that had logged in the last 30 days, since it'd be straightforward enough for us to code. I took this to a group of stakeholders that we had been working with on some previous definitions, which included our CFO, who's also our team's direct manager, and a few people from our sales team. They all agreed that it made sense, but we hadn't really taken a step back to consider if they were the right people to be talking to. We had just worked well with them on some previous data, and so we just kept going. Some time ended up going on, and there ended up being a large gap between when we initially defined it and when we actually looked to start implementing monthly active users. We decided to do a quick sanity check with a wider group of stakeholders, which now contained co-workers from our customer-facing teams. And I shared with them the definition that I prepared in advance. They did not like it. They were under the impression that to be an active user, a teacher should have to log in and then carry out a task on our platform, such as marking an assessment or giving a student feedback. This would avoid counting any teachers that just logged in and out briefly. Thankfully, we were in the earlier stages of this process, and so shifting our definition to their criteria wasn't too stressful. But had we been any further along in the process, this could have led to a lot of wasted time. We realized at this point that it's not just enough to be talking to your stakeholders, but you have to make sure you're talking to the right group of stakeholders. The next time we started to see the flaws in our process, it was in the discoverability section. Our Google Doc had grown from a few pages to over 10, and trying to find a specific word or meaning was becoming more and more difficult. We knew the Google Doc was starting to fall under its own weight. Discoverability is something that we're continuing to work on, as we've still not found a simple solution. We currently use a number of different tools depending on the context. We use that definitive data definition doc to define any broad top-level metrics and commonly used words. We then use DBT documentation for granular data points, or data where the engineering definition and business definition are pretty closely aligned. which definitely isn't always the case. We've also been experimenting with the new exposures feature, and we're really excited to see what this opens up for us. We then use our BI tool to write short paragraphs on top of each dashboard or report to give contextual definitions. From here, we can link back to that definitive doc or the DBT documentation for more information if needed. So we found our process generally works, but we always need to come back and check in to make sure we're overcoming those three barriers in the most appropriate way. Some findings we've got around this: with the engineering implementation side of things, we've spent a lot of this year striving for a perfect model and spending a large amount of time trying to squeeze in every edge case. But a lot of the time, you don't need to go to the effort of getting perfect data. As long as everyone agrees on which parts of the model can be a little more flexible and the implications that could have on the data, we tend to aim for good enough. For example, not all of our classes on the system have their subjects set up. Instead of trying to calculate something or force something into something, we agreed with our stakeholders that we would just mark these as unknown. Trying to identify the right group of stakeholders can be tricky. Obviously, you want to include as many people as you can before you reach the too many cooks in the kitchen stage. Generally, we found that if we don't have at least one person in the room disagreeing with us or challenging what we have, we've got the wrong group of people. We've also found that if people are saying things like, sounds good, sometimes they actually mean that they're too far removed from the situation to know if what we've got is wrong. So when we hear things like that, we'll either challenge them or look to expand our stakeholder group, just to make sure that we are on the right track. And then, like I said, discoverability is an ongoing challenge for us. Right now, we use a combination of different tools which sort of do the job. But I'm aware that as we scale further, this will be the part of the process that we adapt the most. We're really looking forward to seeing how DBT exposures can help us, especially if we can leverage DocBlocks to scale in a way that Google Docs didn't allow us to, while still being easily digestible. So, to wrap up, like I said at the beginning, the main goal we strive for is getting everyone on the same page with our data. We've achieved this by creating a process that we now adapt to each new data point. But our process is always focused on those three barriers: making sure we have the right people in the discussion, making sure we can create appropriate models, and making sure anyone in the company is able to find and use the data. Thank you so much for listening.